On the night of the most emotional duet in music history, neither Whitney Houston nor George Michael was supposed to cry on stage. But when their voices finally met, something broke open in both of them, and 90,000 people witnessed it without understanding what they were really seeing. It was April 23rd, 1993. The venue was Wembley Arena in London, and the event was called Concert for Hope, a massive charity benefit organized in response to the AIDS crisis that had been quietly destroying lives on both sides of the Atlantic. The lineup was extraordinary, the cause was urgent, and the atmosphere backstage, in the hours before showtime, was exactly the kind of carefully managed chaos that only the biggest events in the world can produce. Runners with clipboards, security personnel speaking into earpieces, stylists and sound engineers and managers all moving through narrow corridors with the focused urgency of people who understood that the margin for error tonight was essentially zero. Whitney Houston arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon. She came through the rear entrance with a small entourage, her personal assistant, her vocal coach, two security men. She was wearing a cream-colored coat, her hair pulled back, her face free of stage makeup. She looked composed, professional, ready. She was none of those things. But nobody backstage knew that yet. George Michael arrived 40 minutes later, and he came almost alone. Just his tour manager, a quiet Englishman who had the rare talent of understanding when his employer needed silence. George was dressed in black. He moved through the backstage corridor with the particular unhurried speed that very famous people develop. A pace that communicates, I am not rushing, but somehow still gets them where they need to go faster than everyone else. He had been in London for 3 days already, staying at a hotel in Mayfair, going out very little, ordering room service and working on music in the small hours of the morning, the way he always did when something was pressing against him from the inside. And music was the only pressure valve that actually worked. He had agreed to perform at Concert for Hope because the cause mattered to him deeply. More deeply than most people knew, more personally than he had ever said publicly. That part of the evening he felt clear about. It was everything else that felt uncertain. They had met before, twice, once at a music industry dinner in Los Angeles in 1991, and once briefly at the Grammy Awards the following year. Both encounters had been warm, genuine for about 90 seconds, then interrupted by the machinery of obligation that surrounds famous people at public events. They knew each other the way that certain stars know each other, with real mutual admiration and absolutely no genuine intimacy. That was about to change, but neither of them knew it yet. The schedule had them performing separately. Whitney was closing the first half. George was opening the second half. There was no duet planned, no shared rehearsal, no moment where they were supposed to stand at the same microphone and sing the same song together. What happened instead began in a small lounge off the main backstage corridor, the kind of room that venues put on blueprints and then promptly forget about. There was a couch against one wall, a small table, a floor lamp giving off yellowish light, and in the corner against all reasonable expectation, an upright piano. Old, slightly out of tune in the upper registers. The kind of piano that survives in backstage rooms because it's too heavy to bother moving and not valuable enough to sell. Whitney found the room at 6:45, an hour and 15 minutes before her set. She was looking for somewhere quiet, not the main green room, which was full of the cheerful, professional noise of people who were good at pretending everything was fine. Somewhere she could just sit with what she was carrying without having to perform the version of herself that everyone expected. She was carrying quite a lot that night. The marriage had been deteriorating for months in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. There had been an argument that morning, not about any one specific thing, but carrying the exhausted weight of two people who have had the same fight so many times that they are no longer really fighting about the subject of the fight at all. She had gotten on the plane to London with that argument still alive inside her. She had smiled at the flight attendants. She had signed an autograph for a child in the terminal. She had done what she always did, taken whatever was breaking her privately and folded it carefully away where no one could see it. She sat down at the old piano and played a single chord with her right hand, then another. She wasn't playing anything in particular, just touching the keys the way you touch something familiar when you need to feel anchored. She had grown up with music the way other people grow up with language. It was not something she did, it was something she was. And when everything else became noise and obligation and performance, the act of simply touching keys in a quiet room was one of the few things that still felt like it belonged entirely to her. She didn't hear the door open. George Michael had found the room for similar reasons, following a corridor he didn't recognize until he reached a door slightly ajar and pushed it open without thinking. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she heard him stop. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the small room, both surprised, both not entirely sorry to have been found. "I didn't know anyone was in here," he said. "Neither did I," she said, which made no logical sense, but he understood what she meant immediately. Understood it the way you understand certain things when you are in the presence of someone who is carrying something of the same shape and weight as what you are carrying, and language stops being the most useful tool available. He came and sat on the bench beside her, leaving a careful distance between them, and he played a chord. Then she played one. They were not playing together yet, just testing the instrument, testing the room, testing the strange permission that comes when two people who are each carrying too much happen to find themselves alone together in a quiet place. Then George began to play something, slowly with both hands. The opening notes of a song he'd been working on in fragments for months. A chord progression in a melody, and the ghost of a lyric that kept changing every time he tried to write it down. It wasn't finished. It was barely started. Whitney listened. She didn't say anything for a long time. "What is that?" she finally asked. "I don't know yet," he said. She put her right hand on the keys, found the melody he was playing, and followed it. She went somewhere slightly different in the third bar, found a harmony that surprised him. He looked at her. She looked at the piano. They played it again from the beginning. They played for 23 minutes. Nobody interrupted them. The backstage world moved on without them, and for 23 minutes, two of the most famous voices in the world sat together in a small room and played an unfinished song and didn't talk about anything that was actually wrong. Then Whitney's assistant opened the door, apologetic and urgent, and said it was time. George stood up from the piano bench. Whitney stood up beside him. "That song," she said. "Finish it." "Maybe," he said. She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when you've recognized something in them that you rarely see clearly in yourself. "You should come out at the end of my set," she said. "Just come out. We'll figure it out." He should have said no. There was no rehearsal, no arrangement, no agreement with the show's producers or the musical director or anyone whose job was to ensure nothing unplanned happened on that stage. Saying yes was the kind of decision that made tour managers age prematurely and sound engineers reach for their headsets with expressions of controlled terror. "Okay," he said. What happened on that stage in the final 4 minutes of Whitney's set has been described by the people who were there as one of those moments that doesn't quite fit into normal memory. Whitney was singing with the kind of authority that reminded everyone why she was considered the greatest voice of her generation. Not performing, not executing, but actually inside the music. She had arrived carrying an argument and a marriage and a private weight, and somewhere in the first song it had stopped being something she was holding and started being something she was singing. And those are not the same thing at all. The crowd felt it. Crowds always feel it, even when they can't name what they're feeling. But the most extraordinary moment was still coming, and nobody in that building had any idea. Then the lights shifted. The musical director, given 11 minutes of warning and responding with the rapid improvisation that earns people their reputations, began playing the opening progression of the unfinished song. Slower than the version in the small room, more spacious. Room for two voices. George walked out from the wings. The roar from 90,000 people was immediate. Two of the biggest voices in the world, standing at the same microphone, in a concert neither had planned to share. Then Whitney began to sing. Her voice that night had something in it that went beyond technique, beyond even the extraordinary instrument she'd been given at birth. It had the quality of something held in too long that had finally found an opening. It had the quality of grief that has stopped pretending to be something else. It had the quality of a woman who had spent years being the voice everyone else leaned on, and who had found in this small, unexpected moment a place where she didn't have to hold anything up. George listened for 4 bars. Then he came in. His voice against hers was not what anyone would have predicted. Whitney's was a cathedral, enormous, perfectly constructed, capable of things that seemed to defy the physical limits of what a human throat could produce. George's was intimate, searching, built for close distance. The kind of voice that finds you wherever you're sitting and makes you feel it's singing only to you. Together they should not have worked as well as they did. They worked better than anyone had ever heard two voices work. Somewhere in the second verse, something happened that nobody had planned and nobody could have planned. Both of them began to cry. Not dramatically, not the kind of crying that performers sometimes do on stage for the audience, in the quiet way. The way that happens when something true is moving through you and your body responds before your mind can intervene. The audience went completely silent. 90,000 people in a venue designed for noise, producing a silence that was the opposite of emptiness, full of held breath and recognition, and something the people there would spend the rest of their lives trying to find words for. Wait, because what came next was the moment no one who was there would ever fully be able to explain. They finished the song. The last note faded. The silence held for 3 full seconds. In live concerts, 3 full seconds of silence is an eternity, a measure of how completely an audience has been stopped in its tracks. Then the sound of 90,000 people who have witnessed something they did not expect broke over the stage like a wave, and Whitney and George were inside it, and both of them were crying, and both of them were laughing slightly at crying, and they looked at each other for the first time since walking out onto the stage. They came off the same wing, still close, still inside whatever the music had opened between them. Whitney's makeup artist was waiting with a cloth. George's tour manager was standing very still with the expression of a man who has just survived something he wasn't certain he would survive. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Whitney said, "You finished the song." George looked at her. "I had help." They did not see each other again in any meaningful way after that night. The machinery of 2 enormous careers pulled them in different directions immediately. The unfinished song remained unfinished. The moment in the small room with the slightly out-of-tune piano remained between them, like a secret neither of them had agreed to keep, but both of them had kept anyway. Years passed. Both of them carried what they had carried into that night, and the weight of it shifted and changed, and sometimes became heavier than it had been before. Both of them struggled in ways the public could sometimes see and could never fully understand. Both of them kept making music that moved people. Music that had in it, if you listen closely enough, something of that night. Something of the piano in the forgotten room. Something of 2 voices finding each other in a space where neither of them had expected to be found. Whitney Houston died in February 2012. George Michael died in December 2016. Between those 2 losses, the people who had been backstage that night began to talk. Slowly at first, the way people talk about things they are not sure they are allowed to talk about. The musical director gave one interview years later, describing the 11 minutes of warning and the improvisation and what it had sounded like from his position at the piano when those 2 voices found each other in the air above the stage. He said he had been doing live sound for 30 years, and he had never experienced anything like it. Not technically, but emotionally, the way the room changed when the 2 voices combined, as if the air itself was doing something different. A lighting technician described watching from the gantry above, seeing the moment when both of them started to cry, and thinking without being able to explain why, that he was watching something that would not happen again. The recording from that night exists. It exists in an archive somewhere in London, held by a production company that has never released it publicly and has, when asked, declined to comment on whether it will ever be released at all. It has been heard by very few people, and those who have heard it tend to describe the experience in similar terms. A quality of presence, of reality, of 2 human beings being completely themselves in a way that famous people rarely get to be in public. A quality of grief and grace moving through music together, which is perhaps the oldest thing that music has ever been used for, and perhaps the reason it was invented in the first place. There is a story that one of Whitney's close friends told years after her death. They had been talking about Concert for Hope, and the friend asked what the duet had been like from the inside. Whitney had been quiet for a moment. "It was the only time," she finally said, "that I ever felt like the music was holding me instead of me holding the music." She didn't say anything else. She moved the conversation somewhere else, the way she moved most things that mattered too much for ordinary language. But her friend remembered it. And years later, after Whitney was gone and George was gone, and the stage at Wembley had held 1,000 other performances that no one would remember the way they remembered that night, her friend told the story to someone who wrote it down. On the night of the most emotional duet in music history, neither Whitney Houston nor George Michael was supposed to cry on stage. They were supposed to perform. They were supposed to be professional. They were supposed to give the audience what it had come to receive, and then walk off and continue the carefully managed lives they had built around the extraordinary and sometimes terrible fact of their own voices. They were supposed to be the voice and the voice, two instruments in separate cases, brought out for separate occasions, never meant to play the same song at the same moment in the same key. Instead, they found each other in a forgotten room. Instead, they played an unfinished song on an out-of-tune piano. Instead, they walked out onto a stage without a plan and let the music do what music does when it is given enough truth to work with. And 90,000 people witnessed it without fully understanding what they were seeing. They were seeing two people who had spent their lives giving their voices to the world, finally giving their voices to each other. That is what it looked like from the outside. From the inside, both of them said later, in different ways and at different times, it felt like coming home to a place you had never been before, but had always been trying to find.